I want to talk to you guys about the Victory Day Parade, or the Cope Day Parade, or whatever you want to call it, that just happened in Russia, that just happened in Moscow. Well, happened in Moscow, but didn't happen across all of Russia as is tradition. We're going to talk about that in a second. Now, Victory Day for most people is celebrated on May 8th. Ukraine came out and celebrated it on May 8th. President Zelensky released a long speech about, their fight against Nazism, their struggle against Nazi Germany. I saw a lot of people saying, oh, Zelensky isn't celebrating it on May 9th. See, he doesn't care about beating the Nazis. He's terrible, and I can't believe he's disrespecting the veterans of the Great Patriotic War. But he did celebrate it. He just celebrated it like every other country in the world celebrates it on May 8th. That is Victory Day for every other country on the planet. May 9th is when the Russians celebrate it. And just the Russians. I think maybe Belarus does it as well, but the rest of the world does it on May 8th. And Ukraine is differentiating itself from Russia and the way they celebrate Victory Day Parade, which makes it one of the largest holidays of the year. They put a lot of cultural weight into the parade, and it's now become a nationalistic drumbeat trying to beat up the population to go to war. And so I believe that Zelensky sees this, just like a lot of other Ukrainians sees this, and are separating them from that tradition. They don't want to be a part of something that has now become so nationalistically driven and so driven into whipping the population to go to war with Ukraine. It makes sense. It makes sense they wouldn't want to be a part of that. Anyway, they had a parade and it didn't go great. So first things first, a lot of the localities that would usually host a parade canceled in advance. Because they were afraid that the Ukrainians would blow up their armored vehicles or attack their soldiers, do a drone attack, maybe a missile attack in regions bordering Ukraine. Like, for example, Belgorod even specifically referenced as to why they were canceling the parade, saying they didn't want to provoke the Ukrainians. They didn't want to provoke the Ukrainians into striking them or attacking any of the soldiers that are taking place. So they're doing it for safety reasons. But I don't think it's just for safety reasons, because some regions, like certain areas in Siberia, also canceled their parades. So I think it's a combination of not only safety concerns, because the Ukrainians could, attack these troop concentrations that are marching in, neatly ordered lines, but I think it also is because they don't have enough vehicles to go around. They do not have enough tanks to be doing these parades in all these different localities across the country. They barely had enough tanks to even show a tank in Moscow. We're going to talk about that in a second. But let's show what did occur in Moscow. Also, if any of you were waiting for I think they call it the Parade of the Immortals, which is when, if I got the phrase wrong or the name wrong, it's basically a march where a bunch of people take signs of their family members who fought in World War II and are, dead, and they march with them in order to remember those who have died fighting against the Nazi menace. That was also canceled, and I don't know exactly why that was canceled, because that couldn't be because of a tank shortage. You don't need tanks to do the Parade of the Immortals. What is it called? It's not the show. I was about to call it the Showcase of the Immortals. It's not the Showcase of the Immortals. That's WWE. That's WrestleMania. Oh, it's called the Immortal Regiment. Yeah, that's what it's called. I heard from some people speculating online. I know that on DW, there was a DW segment where they were speculating that the reason they canceled that was because they didn't want people to bring signs with people who had died fighting in Ukraine, and then maybe a lot of people show up with signs. People look around, see all the signs, and they're like, "Whoa, that's a lot of signs for dead bodies." Man, I think maybe the government's, lying about exactly how bad this is going, but that's all pure speculation. Of course, the Russian government isn't going to come out and say, "Don't bring signs of your dead relatives. It might make us look bad." So anyway, let's look at a few minutes of the parade, of the Victory Day March that they did host in Moscow, which the Russians want to show their population, to whip them into shape for the war, and to celebrate their victory over Nazism. Let's see. We're not going to watch a ton of it because we've all seen this before. It's just like any other Victory Day parade, except for one absence that we're going to talk about in a moment. Let's just get to the actual parade section. Here we are. Yeah, let's get to this, the actual marching. Those are high kicks. You get the idea. We've all seen this before. They do the whole parade, they do the big high kicks, they do the whole goose step, they do the whole shebang, right? They have all the different units march. But something that was different from the rest of the parades that they historically did is that there was not a lot of armored vehicles. And of the armored vehicles that were there were like a lot less of them. Not as much as there usually is. And I could go through all the photographs that were comparing where this seems to be like half of the amount of armored vehicles that are usually there. I think one of the most obvious examples of this that has been memed a ton online is the fact that there was only one, and I mean one, tank for the entire parade. And during these Victory Day parades, Russia loves to roll out their tanks. They show their T-14s, but I think last year one of their T-14s broke down because it has a notoriously unreliable engine. They roll out their T-90s, and of course their more classic, but it's not very that classic for this war, T-72s, and they roll them out row after row after row to show the armored heart, the armored, spine of Russia's military. And this was the only tank right here, a T-34, not a T-90, not a T-14 Armada, not even a T-72. No. A T-34, a World War II era tank. Here it is. The only tank for the entire parade. Everything else was trucks and lightly armored vehicles. There is the armored spine of Russia's military on display in Moscow. Now, the obvious reason for this that I think Moscow would be, less willing to admit is the fact that the vast majority of Russia's armored tank fleet is busy fighting in Ukraine. All their T-90s, all their T-72s, they're busy either A, getting blown up in Ukraine, or B, currently in service in Ukraine because of how many tanks they've lost in this war. And if we're just going off of visually confirmed tanks that have been destroyed, not everything that is reported by the Russians, not everything that's reported by the Ukrainians, but just what is visually confirmed, what we have public photographs of, there's about 2,000 tanks that Russia has lost. And we're talking about this being the low estimate because we're just talking about what's been publicly confirmed by open source intelligence. That is, basically online volunteers who goes through all these photographs saying, that's a different tank, that's a different tank, that's a different tank. I forget how to pronounce the name of one of the more popular people who does this. I think it's Oryx. He has a big list where you can go see all these armored vehicles that have been destroyed. And if you go outside of tanks, we're talking like 3,500, 4,000, like a crazy amount of armored vehicles. So if these are the amount of armored vehicles that have been destroyed, that means that Russia's had to dig deep into its reserves, dig deep into its more old tanks that they might not want to brag about more and put them into service. And a lot of them, they're not going to want to display in Moscow unless it's for ceremonial purposes, like this T-34. This is a museum piece. This tank is called the Pride tank. By the way, this tank was designed in Kharkiv, Ukraine, by the way. So Ukrainian engineering, been going on for 80, 90 years now. So they can't display this armored glory anymore because that armored glory has been torn apart. And so they've been humiliated online, they're getting mocked online. But outside of the fact that Russia cannot display its armored glory anymore, I want to talk about what was actually said during the speech portion, because Putin, to my surprise, actually did make a public appearance. Originally, we were hearing he was going to do like a video call in, he was going to, from a different location, like a bunker or something, who knew, because he was just so busy. But no, he actually went and he did the speech, he did the whole shebang. And I want to actually listen to what the guy had to say. Now, it wasn't a tremendously long speech, and he didn't say anything new. But considering that this is now our second Victory Day parade during the war in Ukraine, I want to see if the narrative has changed at all and just check in on how Putin's doing, since he's making so few public appearances and so few public statements. So let's see what the man had to say.
Let's cut over to Moscow and listen in.
I congratulate you on the day of victory. We honor our fathers, grandfathers that were glorious and whose names are to be remembered forever. They have sacrificed a lot in order to save the earth from Nazism. Once again, we are at a turning point. Again, there are enemies, and there is a real war going on around us. But we are standing up against international terrorism. We defend our security and don't.
Standing up against international terrorism. To be clear, their version of a terror attack against them, their terrible misdeeds against them, is a dinky drone going next to the Kremlin and blowing up near a flag, injuring and killing no one. While what they perpetrate in Ukraine, just like a few days ago, I think it was a week ago at this point, they're bombing grocery stores in Kherson, the territory they were pushed out of by the Ukrainian military and by locals, killing 22 civilians, leveling apartment blocks. We've uncovered the mass graves, and we're supposed to feel sympathetic about a dinky drone blowing up next to a flag.
Donbass. For us, for Russia.
I'm also saying they're protecting the Donbass. Now, this is something that is talked about a lot. It feels weird going through all these propaganda points and going one by one, but on the off chance there's somebody in here that hasn't heard me say these points before, the Russians have killed more people in the Donbass than any terrorist group that would hate the Donbass people for whatever reason more than anything in the world could only dream of. For example, in 2021, the year before the Russian invasion, 9 people died in the Donbass. Both sides of the contact line, by the way, from a variety of things, a lot of it being unexploded munitions and some of it being shelling. And now that 9 people dying is a tragedy. But if you compare that to 2022, in 2023, it's incomparable. It's such a fraction of percent of the death and destruction Russia has wrought upon the Donbass, the quote-unquote Russian-speaking population that they've come to liberate. They don't care about the liberation of the Donbass from suffering and terrorism, because they're the main terroristic actor in that region if they're going to be using terrorism in this way. If they're going to be using this word in this way, they're the ones causing the most terrorism, the most destruction, and the most death for the people of the Donbass.
There are no enemy nations, neither in the West nor in the East. The majority of people on Earth thinks like we do. We want to see a world that is free, stable, and peaceful. We think that every ideology of superiority...
How many countries do you have to invade to make it peaceful? Like, how many times do you have to bomb countries to peace, Like, it's very silly. Like, George Bush invading Iraq. This is for a more peaceful world. Just very silly.
Priority is horrendous.
What is it? War is peace, freedom is slavery, yada, yada.
Is terroristic. The global elites still believe they are superior. They are provoking bloodshed, conflicts, and they nourish nationalism and Russophobia.
You know, it's weird when I hear like politicians of such power and influence like Putin call out the global elites. He's part of the global elites. He's part of a different group of global elites that has a different set of interests than another set of global elites. But he is a dictator of one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, if not the most resource-rich country in the world. He is a dictator with immense power, immense influence, and immense wealth. For those of you who don't know about his wealth, while I know many in my chat for good reasons have criticisms of Alexei Navalny, he produced a documentary going into the illustrious wealth of Putin in his grand mansions and his gold and his gold and his wealth and his luxury that he lives in. He is a part of the elite. He's just calling out a different section of the elite that has competing interests with him.
They destroy family values, traditional values that make men human beings.
So this is just like, you know, the usual, the trans, the non-binaries, and while he's not saying it specifically here, he's talked about, like, in his declaration of war, in his speech to go to war with Ukraine, he specifically cited J.K. Rowling, as in the fact that J.K. Rowling was canceled on Twitter over, you know, transphobia. Now, I don't care what your position is on J.K. Rowling and whether you think they're transphobic or not. Not the time or place for that conversation. And bringing that up should just raise eyebrows, as he's going to invade, bomb, and kill people. And he's talking about the author of the Harry Potter series. He's delving his toes into the culture war in order to try to make inroads with the right wing internationally that are angry about these culture war issues, specifically the American right, which he knows has isolationist tendencies that he could possibly exploit in order to undermine international support for Ukraine. That's the purpose of making these types of cultural call-outs. And this is not even a secret that the Russians want to do this. The Internet Research Agency during the 2016 election tried to do this as well by spreading misinformation online. This has been confirmed. This is public knowledge at this point. There's books taught to the Russian military economy, taught to Russian officers, like the Foundations for Geopolitics, which was written by Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin, not as influential as people lead you to believe. More influential now that his daughter was car bombed, which, you know, out there during a nighttime, I think, what was it, like 8, 9, 10 months ago? But his book, The Foundation of Geopolitics, is taught in Russian military academies, and it explicitly calls for trying to undermine the peace and stability of the United States by trying to cause internal divisions. And this is the Russian government trying to make references in order to make inroads to communities that they hope could, you know, increase the fervor in those communities, cause internal divisions, and undermine support for Ukraine.
They do that in order to dictate, to impose their will onto the people. They want to grab everything they can. And
also, can I just say, it's hard for me to take anyone seriously when they say they're like a family values guy, and then they proceed to go out and kill tens of thousands of families. Just like mothers, daughters, sons. It's hard to be pro-family values if you're killing children and bombing drama theaters clearly marked for protecting refugee and displaced children, which happened in Mariupol.
We have not forgotten what it means when Nazis come to power. We have not forgotten who has started such horrible events, and we have sacrificed our lives in order to save the peoples of Europe.
Can I give the hot take? I'm going to give the hot take, okay? And I know this is a hot take and I might get some pushback on it, but it's also true. The Soviet Union is partially responsible for the start of World War II and enabling the Nazis during the early stages. Now, I don't need to get into all the details and how they enabled the Nazis and how they were commanding different communists across Europe to not undermine the Nazis' invasions of those countries and to cooperate with them. But I think the most obvious example of this would be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which allowed Hitler to secure his flank as he invaded Poland, and then they split up Poland between them, between the two, between the Soviet Union and between the Germans. The Soviets then engaged in mass deportation of Poles and then deported German communists to the Reich, which they then Holocaust and murdered. They then enabled them, traded resources with them, enabled the German war machine with war material as they fought France, conquered the Netherlands, conquered Denmark, conquered Norway, conquered Belgium, Luxembourg, all these countries, marched their armies across Europe, engaged in a terror bombing campaign in the UK. None of this stopped them from trading with them. They continued to fuel the German war machine. They continued to not instruct German communists to engage in resistance efforts. They continued to enable Hitler up until Operation Barbarossa, and up until that day, until Hitler turned on him. He wanted Hitler to be distracted with the West, to fight the West, to cripple the West, which they saw as one of their more long-term opponents, while they prepared their own strength themselves. And it came back to bite them in the ass when, if the Soviet Union allied with the United Kingdom and France during those early stages of the war, when he tried to march into Poland, maybe the war could have been shorter. Maybe he wouldn't have gone as far. Maybe if he also had to deal with the Soviets as well as the Poles, and the Soviets maybe could have gotten over their hatred of the Polish government because the Poles gave him, kicked their teeth in during the Soviet invasion of Poland in the 1920s, maybe Hitler couldn't have conquered France. Maybe Hitler couldn't have conquered Norway. Maybe Hitler couldn't have gotten as far, and the amount of deaths that the Soviet Union saw, that France saw, that everyone saw could have been lessened. Maybe the full effects of the Holocaust could have been lessened. But no, that's not the war that we saw. That's not the history, the timeline that we're living in. And now we have to deal with the consequences of it. It's good that the Soviet Union eventually, when forced to, fought the Nazis. But let's also not pretend that from day one, they were the main force against Nazi Germany. That's not the case. Winston Churchill, somebody that I'm not a fan of. I can talk about the enabling of famine that he was engaged in, or his more imperial viewpoints that I really disagree with. He was more of a committed anti-Nazi than Joseph Stalin. And that's saying something, considering, Winston Churchill's, tendencies in imperialism.
We once again see that memorials to the Soviet soldiers, the great armed forces, are being destroyed. Nazis and their helpers are once again surfacing, and they would like to prevail. And this is disrespect for the sacrifice.
Oh, and I'm not even going to get into the fact that a lot of the soldiers who resisted the Nazis when the Soviets wouldn't in those early stages then were arrested when the Soviet Union came to liberate, their words, liberate large sections of Europe and then install their own governments with heavily controlled elections where they would not allow all political parties to participate. Just saying. They arrested the people who were then more committed anti-fascists than the Soviet regime.
Sacrifices. We see the attempts of those who would like to once again attack Russia. They have developed neo-Nazi niches all around the world, and they would like to destroy our country, make it.
Wait, can I hear what he just said again?
Those who would like to once again attack Russia for the sacrifices. We see the attempts of those who would like to once again attack Russia. They have developed neo-Nazi niches all around the world.
What's interesting is that I don't know if you guys, actually, I can use a resource that was provided to me recently by a friend who went through all of the different election monitors, quote unquote, that were involved in Crimea. Let me see if I can pull this up quick. I don't know if I can show it on screen because it's not my work to show, I don't think. So let me show this. Let me look at this off screen. But the amount of far right and in many instances just basically blatantly neo-Nazi organizations that were involved in quote unquote election monitoring in Crimea during the Crimea referendum, which was a fraud, which was a sham, is actually crazy. One second. at least nine separate Nazi organizations were involved in quote unquote election monitoring in Crimea. Oh my fucking god! I think I'll link some of the organizations below this video when this is uploaded on DylanBurnsLIVE. I can't pronounce half the names of the organizations, and that's not even talking about the neo-fascist organizations that aren't like explicitly Nazi, but they're fascist in nature. Like, the Russians are perfectly willing to work with fascists when they have the opportunity, if it can benefit them. Just like, for example, Rusich, a neo-Nazi militia that the Russians are arming to fight the Ukrainians in Ukraine. And their members will release blog posts talking about the dirty Ukrainians and how we need to ban the Ukrainian language and we need to beat Russian into the Ukrainian people. So it's just very hard for me to take that strong, committed anti-Nazi stance of the Russian government super seriously as they're claiming to be engaged in a struggle against Nazism in Ukraine.
And they would like to destroy our country, make it disintegrate. And as a conclusion of the Second World War, they think they want to overthrow international law, and they would like to crush all centers of development that want to be free. And therefore, there is a tragedy that can unfold once again. This is a disaster that we see in the Ukraine at the moment. Ukraine has become hostage to such horrendous Western regimes. They are using everything they can in order to implement their plans. You
know what's interesting when we talk about Ukraine being a Western puppet? When the Euromaidan happened, the West didn't want it. And that's the interesting part about Euromaidan, is that the West wanted, if you believe the Victoria Nuland phone call, which is talked about all the time as evidence against Ukraine being a sovereign, independent country, but if you believe that phone call, and that phone call is to be believed, they wanted the Ukrainians to accept the deal that Klitschko had negotiated with the Yanukovych government. But the Euromaidan protesters did not accept the deal, continued protesting. Yanukovych then tried to ban protesting, make it illegal, and that seemed to be a straw too far. He kind of panicked, then he fled the country. And then they had an interim government before they then had democratic elections where Petro Poroshenko was democratically elected. If we controlled them and they were just our puppets, why did the protesters that were supposedly us organizing a coup not do what the United States wanted?
Honor the legacy of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War. But we now have to stand up and counteract neo-Nazis once again. The armies of the United States, the UK and other countries, they have participated in defeating Japan, nationalism and fascism. We have fought against many threats, and this is our legacy that we are going to follow today. Today, when there is a movement to create a multipolar, just world, we stand up for security, indivisible security. So we want to make sure that every country, that every nation has rights to develop freely. Today,
every nation has rights to develop freely. Proceeds to level city after city after city in Ukraine. They capture cities and then openly admit the city no longer exists. There's not a single building left standing in the city that's usable. We will not rebuild it. Doesn't sound like development to me if you're wiping cities off the face of the earth.
You
just look at Popasna, for example. Just Google it. Just Google it. You know what? We'll Google it right now. They always pronounce it incorrectly. But here we go. It was a city of 20,000. Where is it? In December of 2022. Okay, 2 months after the Battle of Popasna, a Reuters reporter toured the town in July and reported that the town looked entirely deserted by both humans and animals, with nearly all of its buildings either destroyed or heavily damaged. The leader of the Russian Luhansk People's Republic stated there is no point in rebuilding the city destroyed during the Russian assault. Just do it, just openly. You know, the city's gone. It is what it is. Bye-bye. Doesn't sound like development to me. It sounds like they would rather the city not exist than it be lived in by free Ukrainians.
Moscow, we have assembled the leaders of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Together, we fought in the Great Patriotic War. All the nations of the Soviet Union have made a contribution to the victory. We will remember that forever. And we cherish the memory of everyone whose life was taken in that war. We greet their fathers, their sons, their daughters. And we remember all the brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, relatives that have sacrificed during that war. Let's have a moment of silence.
That's Shoigu? I think that's Shoigu. Defense Minister. He's the guy that Prigozhin's always yelling at, like, stop! You're killing all my boys! He's that guy. Wait, I think I saw... That's Solovyev, the guy in the middle there. Boom. That's Solovyev. He's one of Russia's top propagandists. He's one of the guys who's like, we need to just level the cities to the ground. We need to bomb NATO countries. He's rabid in his bloodthirst.
Thank you.
Уважаемые граждане России,
Dear citizens of
битвы,
Russia,
решающие для судеб нашей Родины,
the battles that are so decisive for our...
By the way, if it feels like I don't have a lot of respect for the ceremony, usually I would. Usually, even if it's in like a government, a regime I don't like, I'll have some like semblance of respect because like, okay, this is very important to a lot of Russians, and you know, they're trying to honor their ancestors who did fight and die against what was a genocidal war against their people. But it's kind of hard for me to have a lot of reverence for the celebratory event if they're using it as a means to produce propaganda to then go to another country and wage a war of annihilation. A war where city after city is getting leveled, mass graves are being turned up every day. It's very difficult for me to, have reference for this event if that's what it's being used for now.
Homeland have always...
That's not even talking about the nationalistic drumbeat that has been this event for the past, well over a decade at this point. But that's a totally different issue for... Actually, this would be a perfect day to talk about it, but I don't have any material on it right now to talk about it with you guys.
It's been sacred to us. We follow our ancestor. We understand what it means to follow their achievements. We are proud to be part of the special military operation. Everybody who serves at the front makes sure that people are being saved, that wounded people are being saved. Your work, your service at the front is so important for our country. The future of our country, of our nation, depends on it. And you are proud to defend your country. You fight for Russia. Your families, your children, your friends are waiting for you. They are convinced that you feel their endless love. Our country stands united to honor our heroes. Everybody is ready to help. Everybody is praying for you.
Друзья, дорогие ветераны,
Comrades, friends, veterans, in every family we have one member that has participated in the great patriotic war. We remember our heroes. We have our memorial places to think of them. Today we stand at the Red Square, on this very ground where Yuri Dolgoruki and other heroes fought.
воинов Петра Великого и Кутузова. Парады
Parades were always taking place here. Also in 1945. Today, we have also members of the special military operation present. These are members of the armed forces that serve as professionals or are working, serving temporarily. We have the FSB here. We have armed forces from Donetsk and Lugansk. I would like to welcome all of you. I would like to welcome all of you who is fighting for Russia.
Dude, if you are one of the armed forces, quote unquote, if we're calling it armed forces, I've actually found some of the equipment from the LPR, DPR. It's not great stuff, man. It's not great stuff. If we're calling that an armed force, okay, but I couldn't imagine being one of those soldiers in Moscow for this event. Because on one hand, you're probably happy to just be away from the hellscape that is the Russian war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, just going back to Ukraine would constantly be in my mind, considering the type of garbage equipment they've gotten during their fighting in Donetsk and Luhansk, the type of disregard they have been treated with, and how they're going to have to go back to some of the heaviest fighting in the war. I couldn't imagine it.
Everyone who is on the front, at the front line, you are successors of our heroic ancestors. They have shown that our unity is the strongest element we have. Nothing can be stronger than our love to our homeland, to Russia, to our noble armed forces, to victory. Hooray!
And there you go. There's the whole ceremony of it. It's not much from Putin. I was somewhat worried that this was going to be, we had the drone blow up behind. By the way, there's where the drone blew up, right up there. He was going to be like, there was a terror attack, and so therefore I'm now going to unleash total war against Ukraine, or he was going to use it to try to mobilize more people. But it seems that maybe he's made the decision that it was too politically risky to try to announce another wave of mobilization. Maybe he believes it's not necessary at the moment. Maybe he believes he never even needs to announce it anymore. They can just kind of do it and not even talk about it. But there's nothing new that was announced with Victory Day Parade. It was humiliating due to the lack of armor and the one tank, yes. But outside of that, this is all just the same stump speech we see as usual. I do think that we should play Zelensky's response to this speech, to Zelensky's response to the Victory Day Parade in Moscow, because he did give a response to reporters when asked about it.
Meanwhile, Moscow's parade did not go down well in Kyiv. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called it an act of propaganda, chiefly aimed at the Russian people. He said the Kremlin was celebrating victory in Ukraine when in actual fact Moscow's war was faltering.
In my opinion, the Russian Federation, their military and political leadership needs something to sell to their people because they have no victories to boast of. Their society is bloodthirsty. We can see how they support certain radical actions.
Oh, I do just want to quickly say that Wagner wanted to capture Bakhmut by May 9th. The Russian government wanted to capture Bakhmut by May 9th. Well, the Russian government wanted to capture Bakhmut last year. The battle for Bakhmut's been going on for 9 to 10 months now. That's like, what, 8.5 Iwo Jimas? I think almost 2 entire battles of Stalingrad. It's been going on for quite a while now. And they've wanted to capture Bakhmut for a while. But another one of the, the dates that they wanted to capture it by was Victory Day, so he could use the event to tout a victory. But he can't do it because they still haven't captured the high rises on the edges of Bakhmut where the Ukrainian government is still making a stand. They control about 10 to 15% of the city still, and the Russians are still taking heavy losses as they use these human wave tactics. And I recently interviewed some soldiers that were fighting in Bakhmut, and the way it was described to me, and this is the part that usually gets left out, what is usually said in the media is this, that the Wagner just takes a bunch of prisoners, throws it at the enemy, and then they all get torn up and they die. It's just human wave tactics. But I think it's not giving the Russians enough credit, because the Russians aren't just completely disregarding the lives of everyone, just the majority of them. What they do is they'll take a bunch of prisoners, a bunch of what they would consider low-trained, low-value meat shields, and they throw them at the Ukrainians. And if they were to retreat or surrender, they can be met with quite brutal punishment, as we've seen from the sledgehammer execution videos that the Russians have done to the Wagner soldiers that surrender or retreat and are not brave enough in combat. And so many of them are fighting for their life. And so they're going to fight very viciously, but they have little training. And so their odds are not, the odds are not stacked in their favor. After they've wiped out this human assault wave, and maybe they've loosened up the Ukrainian targets, then they send in the people with experience in Syria. Then they send in the Wagner boys who have experience in Central Africa or Libya or in other theaters. The experienced people who know what they're doing and are actually quite formidable soldiers. So that's the human wave tactics to kind of loosen them up. Then they send in the real guys. I feel, can I make a Warhammer 40K reference? Can I do that? Or is that inappropriate? Well, I'm going to do it anyway because I don't care. You know how in Warhammer 40K, the God Emperor of Man, okay? I'm not a huge fan of the series, but I at least know this. In Warhammer 40K, human army, if you look them up, there's two types that usually stick out. There's these guys, the grunts, they die in mass, right? Their survival rates are very, very, very low. This is Wagner. And then the actual Wagner, the experienced Wagner guys, they're going to be the Space Marines, the guys in the big power armor, like these boys, right? Of course, that's exaggerating exactly how good the special operators, the people who've been working with Wagner for a while are, but you get the general idea. That's how Wagner operates, and that's how they've operated in Bakhmut, by slamming their head against the wall, but they're slamming one of the least, how you would say, quality parts of the head against the wall, if that makes any sense. They're still sending in Spetsnaz guys, they're still sending in regular infantry as well, but that's how Wagner specifically operates.
They are always happy about the number of deaths. They could not sell Bakhmut because they could not capture it. That was their last really important operation, and they wanted to do it by May 9th. Unfortunately, that town does not exist anymore. Everything has been destroyed.
Anyway, I think that's enough Victory Day coverage. I think what I should do is end Victory Day coverage by allowing a World War II Ukrainian veteran to speak, one of the veterans who fought against Nazism. As much as, a lot of tankies on the internet like to paint Ukraine as a neo-Nazi country. Oh, and they're all or if they're not neo-Nazis, they're the sons of Stefan Bandera or whatever. Over 2 million Ukrainians died in service against Nazism, 2.5 million if we're going to be more accurate. That's a lot of people to die in service against Nazism. I think there was about 5 to 7 million Ukrainians served in the Red Army against the Nazis. And so I do want to highlight one of the few remaining Red Army soldiers in Ukraine and what he thinks about the war and his comments when he went to a Victory Day celebration on May 8th. How do you feel about the war that Russia started against Ukraine? But why should we talk about this war? This Putin should be hanged for this war. Is this a war? This is real genocide. This is genocide when people are killed. And that's that. Okay, let's move on. But I wanted to, it's Victory Day. I feel like I should highlight the words of the people who actually fought in the war.